This isn't 2009, Sloan. We run on real time now. Savannah Thorne's voice sliced through the boardroom like a cold slap, her tone casual, her smile smug. Every pair of eyes around the table turned toward me, some smirking, others deliberately blank. The words hung in the air like smoke. That was how I learned I was being replaced. They didn't even bother to close the blinds. My name is Sloan Mercer. I'm 45, for 16 years. I was the senior systems architect at Halvix. I built their relay network, their compliance logic, and the behavioral routing engine that powers the $870 million platform they were preparing to launch next week. I have no children, no husband, and no hobbies outside the system because I chose to protect it over everything else. 4 months ago, I canceled a flight home to Boston the night before my mother's heart surgery because a Tier 1 client in Singapore triggered a loop failure. I stayed up 41 hours straight, writing a rollback patch so we wouldn't lose the APAC trust license. I didn't sleep. I didn't complain. I've never asked for a raise. And yet, there I was, being publicly dismissed like an outdated manual. Savannah Thorne is 26, a former brand ambassador turned strategic disruptor. She married into the Thorne family last year and was handed a C-suite badge within 6 months. No engineering background, no certifications, no field hours, just hashtags and connections. She renamed the engineering floor to the Hive. She replaced our whiteboards with neon post-its and mood playlists. She referred to my audit reports as legacy clutter. At 8:44 a.m., I sent a red flag email titled, "Potential cross-node leak. Immediate attention required." I detailed a misconfiguration in the launch package, something small, but critical. If ignored, it could compromise real-time load balancing at launch. At 9:06 a.m., I was called into the glass conference room. Savannah sat at the head, sipping her oat milk latte. HR was already there. "We appreciate your years of service," they said. "We're streamlining for agility," they added. I didn't cry, I didn't argue. I stood up, straightened my blazer, and walked out without a word. What they didn't realize, what not a single person in that room understood, was that I hadn't just built the launch system. I'd built 2, and they'd just fired the only person who knew which one was real. The door clicked shut behind me. The sound was soft, almost polite, an odd contrast to the knife that had just been driven into my back. I walked down the hallway on autopilot, back toward the desk I'd occupied for over a decade. Everything looked the same, the polished glass partitions, the brushed steel fixtures, the logo decals reflecting against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Halvix always took pride in looking futuristic. It was the people who were outdated. Apparently. At least. The ones like me. I reached my desk and pressed the power button on my laptop. The screen blinked on, hesitated, then froze. Access denied. I blinked, tried again, same result. I turned to my monitor, logged out. Slack, GitHub, admin panel, credentials, all locked. Not 30 seconds had passed since I left the conference room. I reached for my phone, opened the company app. It crashed on launch. My badge had already been removed from the network registry. They hadn't even waited for me to clear the building. I looked around the floor, eyes searching for something human, some gesture of acknowledgement. I didn't need a hug. I didn't want tears. Just a nod, a glance. A simple signal that I hadn't imagined the last 16 years. But no one looked up. Eli, the DevOps lead who used to grab sushi with me on late nights, eyes glued to his screen. Miranda, who once cried in the supply room after a failed deployment. And I'd stayed with her for 2 hours until she calmed down. She walked past without even turning her head. They weren't cruel. They were terrified. Everyone here knew what happened to people who defended legacy logic over boardroom whims. The new culture didn't punish disloyalty loudly. It just erased you, quietly and completely. But not everyone avoided me. As I reached to unplug my personal charger, I saw her, Amira, the intern from Caltech, just 3 months in. I'd mentored her personally. She once told me I was the first engineer who spoke to her like an equal. She stood by the printer, frozen, holding a stack of onboarding packets. Her eyes locked with mine for a single second. That second said everything. She wasn't old enough to speak up, but she was human enough to look sorry. I nodded once, not in farewell, but in quiet understanding. Then I slipped my hand into my satchel, fingers brushing against something solid. A matte black USB drive. Compact, heavy, layer Sigma. The real system. The one they thought they were launching next week. That was a placeholder, a decoy, a mirror image with training wheels and no teeth. The real build, the adaptive one, with intelligent node handling, encrypted behavioral routing, and compliant failback logic was still in this drive. Still mine. I had created Sigma as a safeguard. Not to hurt the company, but to protect it. I'd spent too many nights fixing other people's shortcuts, watching the pressure mount as inexperienced hands made critical decisions. So I built a second version clean, fault-tolerant, and shielded by biometric protocols no one but me could activate. I never expected to need it, but I also never expected to be fired by someone who couldn't even spell checksum. I stood, zipped my bag, and walked toward the elevator, behind me. The room remained quiet, the kind of quiet that follows something brutal and irreversible. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped in, alone. A faint chime echoed as the floor numbers began to descend. 13, 12, 11. I didn't cry, I didn't rage. I just stood there, watching the numbers tick down like a silent countdown. 10, 9, 8. By the time I reached the lobby, the HR email would already be circulating. By noon, my name would be scrubbed from the org chart. By evening, my contributions would be pitched in the next investor meeting as streamlined innovation. And yet, tucked inside my bag, warm against my hip, was everything they'd need to survive the launch, and everything they'd never touch again without me. Let them try to run it without me, I thought. Let them try to launch something they don't understand. Let them try, and watch it fail. By 10:30 a.m., while my system access was still locked and my name already fading from Halvix's internal roster, Savannah Thorne was going viral. She stood in the middle of what used to be the system's QA lab, now rebranded on the company's social channels as the Innovation Lab. The mood lighting had changed from neutral white to an Instagram filter blue. The wall that once held our disaster recovery whiteboard was now covered in motivational phrases printed in bold, sans serif fonts. Someone had set out branded water bottles and a ring light, and there she was, Savannah, broadcasting live on LinkedIn in a lavender pantsuit and glitter-dipped nails, holding a microphone like she was accepting a Grammy. Halvix 2.0 is here. She beamed. We're proud to be 100% Gen Z powered, zero legacy systems, fully real-time, and built for scale. I nearly choked on my coffee. Zero legacy systems. She was standing inside a room powered by the very framework I'd built on the infrastructure I personally optimized over 4 fiscal years. The only thing real-time about that room was the live comments flooding her video feed. Half of them from investors who had no idea they were watching a premature celebration. She went on. Flashing perfect teeth. This system was redesigned from scratch by a team that thinks forward, not backward. There it was again, backward. That was the word she always used to describe people like me. Engineers with decades of experience, the ones who still annotated dependencies by hand before committing to production, the ones who knew why a system worked, not just how to make it look pretty for a demo. Behind her, I recognized 4 junior staffers nervously fidgeting, Amira included. She held a tablet, but looked like she wanted to disappear. I knew that look. I wore it once, when a male VP pitched my own architecture diagram to the board as his team's collaborative draft. My disgust wasn't just with Savannah, it was with the entire performance. The rewriting of history, The arrogant gloss over foundational work. The belief that you can paint a house neon and call it a skyscraper. And then came the slip. Someone, probably one of the junior engineers, published the official launch build log to the internal GitHub as part of the transparency initiative. And there, in black and white, was the deployment origin created by Mercer. Sloan A. Timestamp October 12th, 2021. It was subtle, buried deep. But it was there. The CTO, Julian Flanagan, saw it first. A quiet man with little patience for theatrics. Julian had always preferred code over conversation. He wasn't my ally, but he respected structure. Around 11:15 a.m., according to someone still on the inside, he walked into the server room holding a printed copy of the metadata log and said, "Why does the new platform still point to Mercer's hash?" The room went still. Savannah reportedly blinked. "We scrubbed everything. Her name's off the documentation. The entire dashboard UI is new, but UI doesn't matter to systems like mine. I'd built the architecture so that the core modules couldn't be overwritten without a verified resign from the original creator. It was a compliance requirement tied to our European security contract hash-locked metadata, immutable once verified, with an internal seed signed by Halvix's own legal chain. You could rebrand, rename, even repaint the front end all you wanted, but the soul of the system still bore my name. And it always would. That realization must have landed like a brick. Savannah had launched a party on top of a foundation she didn't understand. She had paraded herself as the mind behind the platform, while standing on years of work she never acknowledged. And now, the CTO had evidence hard-coded proof that the woman she fired had built the system they were praising. Not only that, the metadata couldn't be removed. It was locked by a system I designed to resist ego-driven edits. In her rush to erase me, she'd forgotten one thing. I built the walls of that house, and I made sure my signature was carved into the foundation where no one could ever scrub it out. They thought they'd locked me out. What they didn't know was that I'd been building my exit plan long before they ever considered showing me the door. While Savannah was busy designing neon dashboards and giving every internal team a brand slogan, I was building something quiet, something deliberate, a system that didn't just run, it remembered and protected itself. Back in late 2021, when I first got wind that the board was looking to restructure legacy operations, I started what I called my shadow build, a second system, architecturally identical on the surface, but vastly different at its core. I named it Layer Sigma, not for theatrics, but for precision. Sigma stood for the sum of all parts. Mine was the only one that knew how they truly fit together. Halvix wanted a flashy launch platform, so I gave them a demo system. Easy to showcase, hard to break, but incapable of scaling in real-world scenarios. It was the version I knew they'd present to investors. The one with just enough performance simulation to convince stakeholders it could handle international traffic. But the real system, the true operational framework, was Sigma. And Sigma only recognized one voice. Mine. It wasn't ego, it was protocol. The European Union's revised Data Privacy Compliance Act, which Halvix signed on to in early 2022, required biometric confirmation for any system managing concurrent live customer data streams. I'd used that clause to design a failsafe that no one questioned because, on paper, it was about external regulation. But the biometric key, both fingerprint and voiceprint, were tied to me. Legally, contractually, and technically, without my confirmation. Sigma couldn't run. Without my clearance, Sigma wouldn't even boot. It didn't matter how many junior engineers tried to override the shell. The deeper logic was encoded in a silent subroutine protocol 8A lockdown that only activated under very specific conditions, like being terminated without documented cause. And I made sure of it. Just over a year ago, I sat alone in the Halvix backend staging room on a Saturday, writing the last line of the script. If I ever got fired without a documented reason, the system would wait exactly 6 minutes, then shut itself down and refuse to run again. No alerts, no noise, just silence. 6 minutes. That was the window. A graceful shutdown. No damage, no warning, no traces left for someone like Savannah to fix with a PR team or an emergency contractor. Just an internal system that quietly folded in on itself and refused to respond again. And now, exactly 6 minutes after 9:06 a.m., when I was dismissed with a patronizing smile and a carefully prepared HR script, Sigma had sealed itself off. They hadn't launched my system. They'd launched the other one, the demo shell, which ran on borrowed threads and canned logic. I knew the signs would start soon: the lag spikes, the caching mismatches, the dropouts in session continuity. It wouldn't crash outright, that would be too easy to trace. Instead, it would decay. Slowly, inconsistently, the kind of failure that couldn't be patched with a UI update or a LinkedIn livestream. Meanwhile, Sigma sat encrypted on my backup drive, safely offline, completely untouched. I sipped coffee in my apartment, the blinds half drawn, dashboards muted. My hands didn't shake, my jaw didn't clench. I wasn't angry, I was prepared. Savannah had mocked me with her line, "This isn't 2009. Sloan, she was right. This wasn't 2009. Because in 2009, I still believed loyalty was mutual. In 2023, I knew better. What they fired wasn't just a person. They fired the checksum, the last line of defense in a system built on trust. And I had written every line of that system with one truth in mind: if they ever forced me out, I'd make sure they couldn't force my legacy to stay behind. By 11:30 a.m., Halvik's headquarters had become a party. Savannah Thorne stood center stage in the company's main atrium, now transformed with branded banners, ambient LED lighting, and a DJ booth playing lo-fi beats, like it was a product launch for sneakers, not the most complex infrastructure deployment in Halvik's history. "We're officially live," people she called out into the mic, voice sparkling with champagne confidence. "Global launch is active. Halvik's 2.0 is now powering 5 continents." Applause erupted across the atrium. Confetti rained down. Cameras flashed. I watched it unfold on my muted screen, sitting alone in my apartment, blinking slowly as the stream buffered. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had built the system they were now launching. Except, they weren't. They had launched the wrong one. The version Savannah deployed that morning, the one their DevOps team packaged for show and tell, was what I used to call Sandbox Shell Alpha. It was a prototype designed for investor simulations. It could run scripted sessions, manage limited user flows, and mimic international data streams under tightly controlled conditions. But it was never meant to go live, and it certainly wasn't built to handle more than 2,000 concurrent sessions. Yet here they were, boasting about infinite scalability while pushing a dress rehearsal into the real world. At 11:42 a.m., the first message hit the incident channel. Client AUS. Load timeout on primary dashboard. Cannot access workflow. Seconds later, Client SG. Button unresponsive. System froze. Client DE. Session auto-logged out after 9 seconds. Then came the calls. At 11:47, a partner firm in Melbourne demanded immediate escalation. They'd just onboarded 800 users into the new system, and not a single one could complete a transaction. Savannah, of course, was still upstairs posing for photos. Julian, the CTO, attempted to open the emergency override console, but his access had been temporarily suspended by a policy pushed from Savannah's admin account the day before. She'd disabled legacy admin tiers, called it clean streamlining. The engineers couldn't even roll back. The real system layer Sigma had already sealed itself. 6 minutes after I was fired, it had initiated protocol lockdown, no biometric confirmation, no unlock, and now the decoy they deployed was buckling under the pressure. At noon, over 24 enterprise clients reported identical issues: data loss, session timeouts, API failures. Everything was coming apart. I could see it: every alert, every error, every desperate attempt to triage because I'd left behind a passive observer script, a small backdoor tucked into the internal logging framework. It didn't allow me to act, but it let me watch. And I watched as the system I built, the real one, sat untouched, waiting silently in the digital shadows, while the company scrambled to stabilize something that was never designed to hold weight. The dread began to spread visibly. You could see it on the faces of the engineers. The panic under Julian's otherwise calm exterior. The realization that what they were running wasn't Halvix 2.0, it was a high-gloss simulation being chewed apart by real-world demand. But the most chilling moment came at 12:09 p.m., when a junior project manager named Tony whispered into his headset, Can someone check if we launched the right build silence?" And then, one by one, the eyes turned toward the screen that showed the build ID. It ended in SBX demo shell. Not Sigma. Not the system that had passed 6 stress test rounds. Not the one engineered to scale and adapt dynamically. Not the one that required my voice to open. They had launched a future I never signed off on an empty shell. And now, with their confetti still on the floor and their homepage stuttering across continents, they would have to face what I'd quietly prepared for. The future doesn't run on hashtags, and it never will. The first server to go dark was Frankfurt at 12:36 p.m. The monitoring dashboard flashed crimson. CPU load spiked past 98%. Memory overflowed. And within 90 seconds, the node triggered its own emergency shutdown. The platform was built to withstand high traffic, but only under intelligent load balancing, which, unbeknownst to the current leadership, had been stripped out the moment they launched the wrong build. The room where they held the innovation launch party was now quiet. The music had been turned off. The ring lights were still glowing, but no one stood in front of them anymore. Only the faint hum of devices, the tapping of desperate keystrokes, and the tight breath of people trying not to admit something had gone terribly wrong. The CTO, Julian Flanagan, stood hunched over a console. His usual calm had cracked. He hadn't said much when the first wave of errors hit, but when the Frankfurt node dropped entirely, he turned white. "Frankfurt just failed load balancing," he said, voice taut. "And now Singapore's following." In his hand was a printed build manifest. He compared it to the system logs flashing across 3 separate monitors. Something wasn't adding up. Error logs weren't being caught. Anomalies weren't being contained. And auto-recovery protocols were non-functional. It was as if the system had forgotten how to defend itself. Julian barked an order to the senior engineer beside him. "Open the source file. Show me the AI diagnostic layer." The engineer blinked. What diagnostic layer? That was the moment. Julian froze. His hands moved faster than his face could register the rising panic. Within seconds, he pulled up the last confirmed source commit from 2 weeks ago, my final secure backup. Then he opened the latest live version. The one pushed yesterday. The one Savannah approved. Line by line, he compared them. His jaw tensed. 40 lines of AI integrity logic, he said. Gone. Entire block stripped. A junior engineer squinted over his shoulder. Wasn't that the segment that analyzed user behavior and load intent pre-routing? Julian didn't answer. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew it was critical. That AI layer had been responsible for real-time anomaly detection and adaptive balancing. Without it, the system couldn't tell the difference between a legitimate user surge and a denial of service pattern. It just choked. The deletion logs showed it clearly, deleted by Thorn admin, date 3 days ago, reason redundant logic, streamlining for MVP. Savannah had removed the brain of the system. She hadn't consulted engineering. She hadn't asked legal. She'd simply pushed a change because, in her words, AI integrity checks slow things down for clean demos. Now, those missing checks were opening the floodgates. "We're flying blind," Julian muttered. At that moment, Amira the intern stood up slowly from her station at the corner of the room. She looked pale, her hands still resting on her keyboard. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I think the system is rejecting us. Everyone turned. What do you mean? Asked the compliance lead. Amira swallowed. I think the framework recognizes that we're not supposed to be running it. I don't mean that metaphorically. I think it knows it's being forced, without its proper owner. There was silence. Then Julian whispered, Layer Sigma. That name hadn't been spoken aloud in the company since I left. Most of them didn't even know it existed. But Julian did. He'd seen my architecture diagram once, in a secure file marked for CTO eyes only. He hadn't said a word then. He was saying everything now. Panic began to ripple across the floor. Calls were coming in from Tokyo, São Paulo, Johannesburg, all reporting similar failures. The decoy system couldn't keep up. The auto failover protocol was gone, and the only person who knew how to rebuild it had been locked out at 9:06 a.m. Savannah was nowhere to be found. The apartment was still, almost too still. Only the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant city traffic filled the silence as I sat at the small desk I rarely used until now. The air felt heavier than usual, like the walls were holding their breath along with me. I hadn't spoken to anyone since I walked out of Halvik's. No calls, no texts. Just the occasional chirp from system notifications still trickling in through a very particular channel, a backdoor I'd quietly built into the logging framework over a year ago. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even unethical. It was part of a compliance shadow monitoring protocol we had tested during internal security drills. No one ever bothered to deactivate it, and I never reminded them it existed. At 1:06 p.m., I opened my laptop. The dashboard blinked once, then loaded fully. And there it was, a live view of the Halvik's launch status. Still connected, still streaming silently into my screen. Errors 274. Live failures 103, API dropouts. Frankfurt, Singapore, Tokyo, São Paulo, Chicago. I didn't smile. I didn't feel triumphant. I just stared. It was like watching someone drown in slow motion, knowing you built the boat they ignored and set adrift without checking for holes. They had launched a shell. They had fired the only person who knew where the reinforcements were hidden. And now, piece by piece, it was collapsing under its own vanity. But the pain in my chest wasn't just about the system. It was about her. As I watched the logs scroll past lines of red text, cascading in real time, a single notification pushed into my inbox. Completely unrelated to Halvik's. Subject Sloan. Thinking of you from mom, date 4 months ago. It had resurfaced from the archive automatically, flagged by the algorithm because I'd read it more than 10 times. I clicked it open. I know you're busy with your big project. I heard you're launching something soon. How exciting. I hope it all goes well. Sweetie, I'll be watching from the other side. Love you always. Mom. She had written that the night before her surgery, the surgery I missed. I was at Halvik's that evening, running emergency bug tests on their new sandbox simulation to impress investors in London. I remember sitting in a freezing data center, eating stale pretzels from a vending machine, staring at a frozen server screen while my phone buzzed quietly on silent in my bag. I didn't get to say goodbye, just a voicemail from the nurse the next morning. And then silence. Permanent. Heavy. Irreversible. My hands trembled slightly on the keyboard. She had believed in me more than anyone, believed in what I built. And in some twisted way, she was right. She was watching the launch, only now. I was watching it, too, not from a boardroom or a control center, but from a dim apartment with a single lamp and a worn sweater wrapped around my shoulders. I glanced back at the dashboard. The numbers were climbing. The system was unraveling. Live, pixel by pixel. I whispered to the empty room, so will I. The words escaped without force, just a breath, a thread of sound carried by memory more than intent. There was grief inside me, grief for my mother, for the version of me that still believed loyalty meant safety, for the years I traded for a company that saw me as a relic the moment I became inconvenient. but I kept it folded, pressed between focus and silence, like the crease of an old letter. That grief wasn't gone. It was shelved, waiting, because soon, very soon, the company that discarded me would come knocking, desperate for the one thing they no longer had. And when they did, I would remember exactly how it felt to be alone at that desk, reading her email while their empire cracked on my screen. By 1:47 p.m., the collapse was no longer internal. The failure had gone global. I didn't hear it first from Halvix. I heard it from Reuters. I was halfway through reheating soup I had no appetite for when the news alert popped onto my laptop. I clicked without thinking. Spoon hovering midair. Breaking Halvix 800 millimeters launch plunges into crisis global access failure reported across 5 continents. Below it, the subheading spelled out what I already knew: platform instability, routing failures, and real-time data loss have triggered a wave of enterprise outages. Stock drops 14% in 2 hours. They tried to spin it. Of course, called it unexpected deployment issues and early-stage optimization challenges. But even a freshman engineering student could smell the truth. They launched a system built for show, not for scale. The shell was collapsing, and now the world knew it. I muted the article's autoplay video. I didn't need to hear the commentators debate recovery strategies or speculate about executive reshuffling. I already knew what was coming next. The real reckoning hadn't happened on a server or in a system log. It was about to happen in a room lined with suits, shareholder portfolios, and egos far more fragile than any architecture I'd ever written. At 2:05 p.m., inside Halvix's 14th floor executive conference suite, the mood had shifted from panic to something worse: exposure. Gone were the champagne flutes. The DJ booth was silent. Even the Innovation Lab signage had been quietly taken down. The emergency board meeting had been called by Langford Capital, Halvix's second-largest investor, whose enterprise partners in Europe and Asia were all simultaneously locked out of the new platform. They didn't demand updates. They demanded accountability. The CEO, Everett Thorne, sat at the head of the table, shoulders tense, eyes hollow. Next to him, Savannah looked pale, her phone face down, fingers clenched into the arms of her designer chair. The Langford representative, a woman named Marion Crane, leaned forward and dropped the question like a blade. "Where is the system's architect?" The room froze. Everett cleared his throat, avoiding eye contact. "The current team is assessing." "No," she snapped. "Not the marketing lead, not the project coordinator. The architect, the one who designed the core system, the one who knows how it actually works." Silence. It stretched, brittle and deafening. Finally, Julian Flanagan, the CTO, spoke. He didn't look at Savannah. He didn't even look at Everett. "She's no longer with us." Crane leaned back. "When was she let go?" Julian hesitated. "This morning." A beat. Then Crane's voice dropped to a slow, icy register. "You fired the architect of a $870 million platform the morning of the global launch." No one responded. The Langford advisor beside her took out a pen and began crossing something off on a printed agreement. Across the table, another investor glanced down at his phone. "We just dropped another 2 points," he muttered. "Nasdaq's flagging this as a red event." Someone else whispered. "They fired her." It rippled like static. Word spreading, comprehension dawning. Not only had Halvix failed, they had orchestrated their own downfall, publicly, spectacularly, and I, alone in my apartment, still in yesterday's sweater, with soup turning cold on the table, felt it land. Not joy, not revenge, just vindication. Because when they discarded me, they didn't just lose a name on a payroll line, they lost the blueprint, the integrity, the backbone. And now, the people they actually cared about, the investors, were asking questions no press release could answer. I clicked back to the dashboard. Session error rate 62%. Server capacity 113% over threshold. Error source routing protocol mismatch. Right where the missing lines used to be. I whispered to no one. It's working exactly as I warned. They erased me from their system, but now the world was watching them break in real time. And my silence. It was louder than anything they'd ever said. At 2:58 p.m., they made their final mistake. Julian Flanagan, the CTO, was pacing the war room floor, fingers twitching as his team scrambled to contain the bleeding. The decoy system, what they thought was Halvix 2.0, was hemorrhaging data faster than their ops team could triage. Asia had gone dark. Europe was down to critical load. Even domestic clients were beginning to drop. One by one. Julian gave the order, forget patches. Bring up the original system. Open layer Sigma. For a moment, everyone paused. Sigma hadn't been mentioned since I left. Most of the room didn't even know it existed. But those who did, the ones who'd seen it in early test environments, knew it was their only shot at restoring real operations. Sigma was the real infrastructure, the one that worked, the one that could have handled everything, if they hadn't buried it under branding and arrogance. Julian opened the root access terminal, typed in the recovery string, system request queued, handshake initiated, and then the response lit up across every monitor in bold red text. Access denied authority. Voided. Legacy rejection. Active biometric owner. Status revoked all third-party access contact. Original architect to reestablish credential chain. The room went silent. Julian's mouth parted slightly. His lips formed a word he didn't speak. On the far end of the table, someone whispered, "What the hell does that mean?" He didn't look up. His voice was even, controlled, but ice cold. It means the system knows we don't belong to it anymore. Savannah had been standing in the corner, staring blankly at her tablet like if she refreshed it hard enough, the errors would disappear. She stepped forward now, her voice shrill, cracking at the edges. "You mean—" She took it with her. Julian turned to her slowly. "No. She didn't take it. We gave it away the second we removed her authority." Savannah looked around, waiting for someone to defend her. No one did. Julian continued, ruthlessly precise, like a surgeon slicing into a diagnosis no one wanted to hear. The biometric owner was hard-coded into the core. Fingerprint, voice print, legal binding via compliance chain. None of it can be overridden without triggering security failsafe, which has already been activated. A junior engineer chimed in, hesitant. "Can't we clone the access key, fake a biometric match?" Julian shook his head. "This isn't facial ID on a phone. It's multi-factor cryptobiometrics. No shortcut, no spoofing." Another monitor flashed a warning, intrusion attempt, blocked system, immune state engaged. Sigma wasn't just rejecting their login, it was treating Halvix like an intruder, a foreign entity attempting to access protected digital architecture, exactly as I'd designed it to. For years, I'd stayed in that building late into the night, auditing code for bugs no one would ever find, building a platform that couldn't just run, it could defend itself. And when they removed me without cause, without grace, without even a conversation, they triggered the final switch, because I'd written it in plain, unassuming logic Python copy edit. I wrote one rule into the system: if I was ever fired without a valid reason, it would immediately shut everyone else out and enter a locked, self-protective mode. Now, they were living in that immune state, not out of vengeance, out of design. They had fired their architect, and Sigma had responded accordingly, calmly, decisively, without emotion, just like I'd built it. On the screen in Julian's hand, another error popped up. Failsafe active. Architect's signature required to reinstate functions. He looked at Savannah, then back at the blinking terminal, and finally, quietly, he said what none of them had been willing to admit all day. She didn't take the system. She was the system. At 3:30 p.m., Just when Halvix believed the day couldn't possibly unravel further, an email arrived in the General Counsel's inbox. Subject formal cease and desist. Unauthorized use of proprietary software system, Layer Sigma, from Ellard Systems. LLC, legal division attached, was a 3-page document, simple in tone but devastating in scope. It stated, without hesitation, that the system Halvix had attempted to access Layer Sigma was the intellectual property of Ellard Systems, a privately held LLC. The notice demanded the immediate cessation of all usage attempts. Citing Clause 7.4 of the Foundational Architecture Agreement, Halvix's own legal team had co-signed over 18 months ago. Julian Flanagan read it twice before handing it silently to the CEO. Everett Thorne stared at the top of the page like it might disappear if he glared hard enough. Ellard Systems. Who the hell are they? Julian didn't respond right away. Instead, he tapped into the company's archived contract repository, pulling up the digital agreement labeled Halvix Architecture Authorization, Mercer. Sloan A. Confidential build. He opened Section 7. There it was. Review Clause 7.4. Ownership terms. In the event that the original architect transitions away from Halvix without renewal of assignment or release of source code rights, all derived modules, including backups, mirrors, and encrypted sublayers revert to ownership by the original licensing entity listed at time of build registration. He scrolled to the bottom of the page. Licensing entity on record Ellard Systems. LLC registered owner, Eleanor C. Mercer, trustee. Julian exhaled slowly. Eleanor C. Mercer. That name hadn't been mentioned at Halvix before, but I knew it well. Ellard had been my mother's maiden name. And 18 months ago, I'd quietly formed the LLC in her name back when early signs of her illness began surfacing, and I started preparing for more than one kind of loss. Through Ellard Systems, I assigned provisional IP ownership of Sigma. Legally clean, structurally secure. The contract had been approved by Halvix's own legal team without a second glance. Because on paper, it seemed procedural. No one questioned a compliance entity with a neutral name and a well-written clause. They never asked where the name came from. They never asked who stood behind it. And now, it was too late. Savannah paced the edge of the room, reading the notice off her phone, her breath coming faster with each paragraph. She turned to Julian, her voice sharp and panicked. She can't do this. We own the code. She built it here. Julian didn't look up. We approved the clause. We signed off on the structure. And she never formally transferred final rights. So we fight it, Everett said. Julian finally looked at him. His voice was steady. Cool. Surgically exact. You can try. But the system's already rejecting our access. This isn't just legal, it's technical. The architecture isn't just locked, it's immune. And unless we get her signature, we stay locked out. Then, almost to himself, he whispered, she built her exit years ago. The weight of that statement settled across the room like dust on glass. While Halvix had been parading flashy slogans and corporate rebrands, I had been writing logic, building layers, and encoding my future. Quietly, strategically. I didn't burn bridges. I installed gates. And now they were standing outside, empty-handed. They had dismissed me like a misplaced folder, fired me without thought, without grace. But I had never needed to scream. I had let the systems speak for me. And now the contracts were speaking too. Not in vengeance, in clarity. They didn't own Layer Sigma. They never had. They had licensed access contingent upon respect, and they revoked that the moment they revoked me. Now, their only path forward was through me. At 4:32 p.m., the war was no longer about recovery, it was about removal. The final blow didn't come from a server crash or a legal injunction. It came from a leaked video 37 seconds long captured by an anonymous engineer during a prep call 3 days before launch. It showed Savannah Thorne, perched casually on the edge of a table, iced matcha in hand, addressing a room of junior staff. We're cutting the diagnostic block. No more AI redundancy logic. It slows the visuals for demos. And it's not like we're deploying live traffic yet. No one outside this room needs to know. If anyone pushes back, tell them it's been reviewed for alignment. She even winked. The audio was crisp, her voice was unmistakable, and the timestamp matched the deletion logs Julian Flanagan had just pulled from the audit trail. It wasn't just arrogance, it was premeditated negligence, a direct cause of the system's collapse. The video spread fast, internally first, then to stakeholders, then to the press. At 5:03 p.m., the Halvix board convened its second emergency meeting of the day. This one had no champagne, no hashtags, no press kits, just files, voices, and a list of names printed beside a single question: vote of confidence. CEO Everett Thorne. Yes, no. The vote was private, but the result wasn't. 7 out of 10 board members voted no. Everett was removed immediately. No golden parachute, no statement. Just an escorted walk out of the building's rear exit, and a quiet note that his access badges were already deactivated. Savannah was next. The board didn't even vote. Legal informed her directly her contract had been voided for cause. She was banned from all Halvix-owned premises and digital networks. Her admin credentials were scrubbed. Her devices seized for internal review. Security stood waiting by the elevator as she gathered her things silent. Red-faced, no longer surrounded by cameras or curated playlists. It wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel, it was clinical. That's what justice looks like when it isn't theatrical, when it isn't revenge. But response. Measured, final, clean. And in that sterile vacuum, a single voice finally rose quiet. Unsure at first, but steady in its intent. It was Amira, the intern. She was seated at the corner of the conference table, hands folded in her lap, notebook open, though she hadn't written a word in the last hour. She cleared her throat. No one looked her way until she spoke. Can we get Sloan back? The room stilled. Julian looked up from his notes. His eyes softened. Just slightly. One of the remaining board members nodded, as if waking from a trance. She's the only one who can fix this, isn't she? No one disagreed. Outside the boardroom, the company's entire system was still running on borrowed time. Failures were stabilizing only because the load had been cut by global disconnection. Sigma, meanwhile, sat sealed, untouchable. The only viable path forward led through one name: mine. But I wasn't there. I was at home, curled in the same corner of my apartment, watching from my silent dashboard. A notification blinked in the corner of my screen. Security clearance revoked. Savannah Thorne role status changed. CEO Everett Thorne inactive. The system was cleaning itself. The company was too. It didn't bring me joy. Not exactly, but there was something settling about it. A calm in seeing the damage for what it was, and knowing I didn't have to destroy them. They'd done it themselves. All I'd done was write the truth into the bones of the system. That truth had waited, patiently, until those who abused it revealed themselves. There's a kind of justice in that, not loud, not vengeful, just right. I stood and crossed the room, pulled open my desk drawer, and looked at the folder inside. It was labeled Ellard Systems, Contingency Contracts. Inside it sat everything I needed to rebuild cleanly, quietly, on my own terms. But I didn't open it yet. I returned to the window and looked out over the skyline. Halvix's building was visible in the distance, just glass and steel and failing systems now. But maybe, just maybe, they were beginning to learn. They had stripped me of a title. They had erased my name from their walls. But when the system broke, when the company crumbled, they didn't ask for the VP of strategy. They asked for the woman who built the thing they tried to take. And that was enough. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the packed auditorium. It wasn't Halvix's atrium. There were no confetti cannons, no DJs, no curated hashtags. This was Technovate West, an independent tech summit in San Jose, hosted by engineers for engineers, the kind of room where buzzwords died quickly, and code spoke louder than marketing. At the front of the main stage, a minimalist LED banner glowed in sharp, clean text Mercer framework, secure, scalable, self-healing. I stepped onto the stage to quiet applause. Not because they didn't recognize me, but because they did. The murmurs died instantly. Every person in the room had followed the Halvik's collapse. Most knew my name. A few had worked with me. Many had quietly cheered when the truth came out. Now, they were here to see what I'd built when no one was watching. Behind me, Sigma renamed, refined, and restructured was already running live on a secure cloud stack. Uptime 62 minutes. Stability 98.4%. No dropouts, no criticals, no drama. I looked out over the crowd, engineers, analysts, founders, people who'd spent nights debugging the impossible, people like me. Then I said the first words I'd prepared. Systems don't fail, people do. A beat of silence. Code can be elegant, architecture can be sound. But the second you replace trust with ego, structure with shortcuts, and wisdom with noise, things break. And sometimes, the person they called obsolete is the one who wrote the only code still standing. No music played beneath me. No lighting effects washed the stage. Just rows of faces leaning in listening, really listening. I didn't build this to make a point. I built it because when systems are created by people who care more about function than credit, they last. And when they break, they heal, because they know who they are. I turned slightly, motioning toward the screen where the framework was rendering user traffic simulations from 4 continents in real time. This isn't a comeback. This is continuity. I never stopped being who I was. I just stopped lending it to people who didn't deserve it. The screen behind me shifted. Now it showed one thing, a sleek plaque. Chief Architect, Sloan Mercer, built for integrity. Not ego. There were no cheers, no standing ovations, just silence. The kind that meant something had landed deeper than applause ever could. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I breathed. Fully. I wasn't rebuilding a reputation. I wasn't reclaiming a title. I was restoring what had always been mine, the right to define myself not by what I endured, but by what I built in spite of it. Outside, Halvik's was still attempting recovery. Their new interim CEO had reached out through legal intermediaries the day before, offered terms, suggested reconciliation. I declined. Not because I was bitter, because I was free. And some bridges aren't worth walking back across even when they're technically still standing. After the session, a young developer approached me mid-20s. Maybe, with a laptop covered in cracked stickers. I watched the whole thing unfold. He said, "I didn't think people like you ever won." I smiled gently. We don't have to win loud. We just have to outlast the noise. We all know someone who's been underestimated, pushed aside, or told they were no longer needed, right before everything they built collapsed without them. If that story sounds familiar, maybe it's time we change the narrative together. If this story resonated with you, drop a comment below, hit like, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe because quiet revenge, honest resilience, and stories that hit deep. That's what we do here. Let's build something real, together.